law matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This program has been created to educate, inform, and help you with the law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We provide information and resources to help you decide whether or not you want to contact a lawyer or an outside professional counsel. If you do decide to seek additional outside counsel, you'll be better prepared, and as a result, so will they. The goal, of course, is for you to save time, save money, and hopefully achieve better results. We welcome and thank from the Bazar Grasso Law Firm in East Providence our team of David Bazar and Jackie Grasso, though David is flying solo today. Welcome.
Yes, thank you.
So some say that questioning the safety and the effectiveness of vaccines has become in the eye of maybe the mainstream media and even the conventional medical establishment, that it's just an unconscionable act. Today we're going to discuss whether or not that question, how that it affects those of us who are now being subjected to a mandate. That HPV vaccination, better known as the Human Papilloma Virus, that's considered to be the leading cause of sexually transmitted diseases in the country. It's headlining the news in Rhode Island and in the neighborhood and in your neighborhood. We thought we should discuss things like civil rights, parents' rights, states' rights. They're among those hot issues that are being debated right now. And as it stands right now, it's slated in Rhode Island to become law that every 7th grade girl and boy must be vaccinated. We know that it's continually being debated in terms of its medical safety and its efficacy. So I think to set it up, for one thing we should tell you is that first, no U.S. federal vaccination laws exist, but throughout all 50 states, there are laws requiring that children have such vaccinations as measles and tetanus and diphtheria, pertussis, polio, rubella, and several others. So let's start with David. Frame this with, what are parents' rights relative to their children when it comes to things like this?
Well, let's start with the whole purpose for having required vaccinations, and then we can take some of them one by one and talk about rights altogether.
Yes.
So
okay.
It's really, it comes down to an issue of public safety, public health versus private rights. And a lot of the early vaccinations that were required were really major public safety concerns and diseases that were very deadly in many cases and transmitted by communicable air or saliva exchanges or touching things and that type of thing. So I always go back in these things to polio. And when polio was a prevalent disease, it was a very devastating disease, and it could be communicated between people much differently than the HPV virus, which is a sexually transmitted disease.
Well, right, and to that point, so those ones that I led off with, they're very well-known vaccinations. Some people still debate and tell you that they don't want their children to have them, but those were highly contagious diseases. This HPV is not highly contagious, and it has everything to do with somebody's personal choice versus just having the ability to breathe in the same room as a child who has chickenpox or measles or whatever.
So, and that's why I say you somewhat have to put these things on a continuum, on a line, and take a look at where is the public safety risk versus the private individual right and the individual's ability to make that decision. So I think we can all agree that with polio and the devastation that that can wreak on a population, if it's not controlled and everybody plays their part in being vaccinated against it, it can be a very devastating thing. And when it was done originally, and it was basically wiped out as an issue, and that's why there might be people who stopped being vaccinated against it, and there was a little bit of a small comeback with polio.
Recently we've read
so
that.
So you can see the effect that a vaccination program can have in protecting public health. So I guess what you're then coming and looking at is on the other side of that continuum is the HPV immunization and what public health risk does it involve. And if you look at it from the terms of genital warts and those types of things, yeah, do we really need to make somebody subject to that? And how is it transmitted? By sexual contact, basically. Although it does have a cancer component, and that's another big public safety issue.
That was a very major issue.
Right. So that's a lot of a reason why there's some uproar with that as being a required vaccination, because on the continuum, it's really at the opposite end of the polio.
Yet, to your point earlier, David, when you were talking about things like polio and measles, there still are parents who will say, I have every right to not vaccinate my child, religious reasons or whatever else, but that's certainly one of the more popular claims. And of course, when that's come up, many other parents would say, how about the right of my child if your child isn't vaccinated? But even for the more well-known and well-accepted vaccinations, some parents will say, I don't really want to do that. I don't believe in that.
Right.
Does the parent have the right to do that?
So here's what you have. In Rhode Island and Massachusetts, there is a religious belief exemption against vaccinations, and certainly I think you could easily argue on the HPV end of it that that is not something that I want to vaccinate my children against. My religion doesn't allow for premarital sex, for example, and that is something that we are going to instill in our children, and for those reasons we don't think, number one, it's necessary. We don't need to go through whatever risks there might be from that vaccination, and the way it's transmitted is against our religious beliefs anyway. So they could execute a certificate claiming the religious exemption. To claim the religious exemption on some of the other vaccinations is a little more difficult, because how do you claim a religious exemption, for instance, against chickenpox, but not against one of the more dangerous diseases that you might be vaccinated against? You know, that's a much more difficult thing to argue, although I suppose you could do that.
So my original question, what are parents' rights in terms of their children, whether they have the property or whatever?
Right.
But some parents will say, I don't want to have a blood transfusion. That's not about vaccination,
right,
but that certainly may be considered a life-saving issue. We don't believe in I don't know if it was Christian Scientists or some
right,
religious, but some believe strongly that they don't want that. Do
right,
they have the right to do that?
So again,
pull the plug or whatever.
And those are all really interesting health-related decisions and things that you can go back to. I forget her first name, but Quinlan,
yes,
right in Florida.
Carolyn Quinlan?
Something like that. It was like Marianne Quinlan, or something like that. But whatever it was, the family was really in a fractured situation where I think maybe the husband, and I could be wrong about this, but let's just say hypothetically, the husband wanted to not keep her alive on health.
Schiavo was another name.
Yeah, and that was another one. Maybe that was Marianne, but whatever. The point being that one side of the family didn't want to keep the person alive artificially, and the other side did, because they didn't believe in religiously making those decisions. And it really highlighted the reason for having in Massachusetts the healthcare proxy, in Rhode Island the healthcare power of attorney, so that you can spell out your desires so that people know what you want, number one, and number two, there's somebody to make those decisions for you.
In the state of Rhode Island, where they're talking about this come September and kids returning to school, this would make Rhode Island, I guess, the second state to mandate this vaccine, but the only state to do so by what they call a regulatory fiat, without public debate and the rest. The ACLU and Rhode Island's Center for Freedom and Prosperity says this is against the privacy of families, not even broaching the subject about religion, but it's against the privacy. Do parents have that kind of right?
Okay,
privacy?
So you asked that question twice, so I probably should answer it.
Just a different way.
Yeah, I probably should answer it at this point. Some states, Rhode Island and Massachusetts, not among those states, have another exemption just on personal belief. Doesn't have to be religious belief, personal choice almost sort of exemption. Rhode Island doesn't have that in our law. The statute talks about what's required, and then at the next paragraph in the statute it talks about signing a certificate based on religious belief in exemption. So it's more towards that personal choice that the ACLU challenge is there. And I really think if there is a challenge to that vaccination as being a requirement for boys and girls, and then you hear people argue, well, boys aren't going to get cervical cancer, but there are other reasons to have it. But the bottom line is that you're taking a situation in a disease, and a disease that's not easily communicable. It's not. It's
Yes.
going to be transferred through some type of sexual communication, some sexual type of situation. It's not through the air, and it's not one of, like I said, it's not on the side of the continuum of polio. That I think a judge could look at that and say, this is the government interfering with people's personal choice. And I think you have to weigh and balance where the government can interfere with people's lives. The goal, I would think, for most people would want their government to interfere with their lives as little as possible.
Yes.
I don't want the government looking over my shoulder. I don't want the government telling me what to do. And the times where that's acceptable are really issues where there's a tremendous or a very high public safety or public health issue, and where your actions will impact other people. So I guess the argument on the side of this case is, where is my choices impacting other people?
Makes sense. And as the law goes, if there is such a debate, say it wasn't the mandate, shouldn't it go by way of the CDC thinks it's a terrific idea, some legislator proposes it, and it's discussed in the legislature, and they make that a rule, or however they mandate, or however they put that into law. What is this regulatory fiat? What is this without public debate? Apparently they are having some public debate, but it's a moot point, apparently, at least in the state of Rhode Island at the moment. How do these things become law? How should this play out, David?
So let's talk about two different ways of making law. Obviously, the one that most people are aware of, and what happens is a bill is introduced either in the House or the Senate, that's debated in the House or the Senate, in whatever committee it would be referred to. If the House passes it, it then goes to the Senate. They then refer it to a committee. They debate it. Then, if they agree, it comes back out. Both sides have voted it as a law. It gets sent to the governor for signature. So there's a lot of opportunity for public input into those types of bills that are passed through the House or the Senate. An agency, Department of Health or whatever agency it is, has a rulemaking process. Most rulemaking processes require the opportunity for public comment. So if it goes through the normal rulemaking process of the agency, then the agency is supposed to publish notice of when there's going to be hearing on it. The public has a right to comment, and that is the normal rulemaking procedure. If something is done without those procedures, that is grounds to challenge it. And there are reasons that you can publish rules without going through the normal process, but there has to be some real exceptions to the rules in order to do that, and I don't see that in this situation.
Exactly, and yet the ACLU is saying we should have the governor intervene here because there wasn't a public debate. Of course, if there's a public debate and we go the route that you are explaining in detail, that does take a longer time. That certainly wouldn't happen by September 1 or whatever date the children go back to, the 7th graders go back to school this fall. So I think the question is, should the governor be able to, or should he be able to, when that's put before them, say, I think this needs to not become a mandate because you think it's a sensible idea?
So in an emergency, an agency can sort of circumvent the rulemaking procedures and do things, and what they would have to basically declare, as you're describing it in this case, is that this is such an important health issue that if we don't act on it so that these immunization requirements are in place by September, there's a big risk to public health, then they could say that's the reason that they're not following the procedures, and that's why they're doing it the way it's being done. I think they would be hard-pressed to go into a court if it was challenged there or somewhere else and say that if this isn't done right now, that there's a big risk to public health. I don't think they're going to sustain that burden. Whether the governor wants to intervene in Rhode Island, she can. In Massachusetts, he can. Well, Massachusetts doesn't have to. This is really a Rhode Island issue right now. The governor can choose to weigh in on it or not, but it's really, there are a number of other ways that it can be looked at and challenged. And again, there is in Rhode Island the religious exemption that a parent could choose to exercise.
Interestingly, Rhode Island seems to be reporting the highest number of vaccinations, which suggests that there's an inclination, a willingness, maybe even an eagerness in some cases to have the children vaccinated, which sort of undermines the idea that they have to, I don't know, for lack of a better word, railroad it through and make it a mandate. But to that point, so Rhode Island say this works. If this becomes a mandate in Rhode Island and it becomes a nationwide mandate, then I guess maybe this is a matter of rhetorical debate or something, but is this a slippery slope of other organizations deciding that, or drug companies deciding that the next best thing should be mandated also? And considering this is all about someone's personal choice, or what you think your child's personal choice unfortunately might be, maybe it's another personal choice about your choice of hair coloring when you're 12 or hair implants when you're 40. I mean, where does that stop when it comes to them being able to just say the CDC or somebody thinks this is a great drug and we should just suddenly all have that mandate?
Right. So it would seem, given the information that you're just relaying, that Rhode Island is already on the higher end of compliance with taking this vaccination, and that based on the situation as we described, what it protects against and how it's communicated or transferred from one person to another, it really should be a decision between the pediatrician and the parent. And that's where this whole discussion should be taking place. The argument, if any, that the Department of Health would make in saying that it's regulation is that for this vaccine to have an efficacy where it's going to be solid medicine for the child and give the most preventable prevention to the disease is by taking it by a certain age. Again, given what the risks are on the other side, it seems to me still that the argument falls on the side of letting the parent choose and make the decision with the consultation with the pediatrician. And
apparently, whether it was a legislator, Michelle Bachmann, I believe, and then Katie Kirk on the other side, the celebrity side, they've had alternate views on how things should or shouldn't be done. Katie, I think, had retracted the statement, but said it's been reported to have caused mental retardation. And I think Bill Gates was the other one who said something about anybody who stands in the way of vaccination is ready to kill children or something. So certainly there's a lot of inflammatory pro and con about all this stuff, and it certainly says that it's being debated. It seems that, not that they should have greater weight on their conversations, but since it's reached that level, that certainly the states should be able to have conversations, the parents should be able to have conversations with doctors, as you're saying, rather than it just becoming a declared law as of September 1.
Right. If you go through a public debate and you have people weighing in on both sides, then the decision makers have more information at their disposal when they decide to pass a law or create a regulation, and that's the whole point of having public input. I have not spoken to pediatricians about this. I'd be curious as to where they come down as a whole. You know, I'm sure each individual pediatrician will have different views and reasons for those views, but wouldn't it be much more interesting and make for better law if you had the ability to hear from people who have some expertise in the area, and that's why we have that opportunity for public debate.
Not coincidentally, David, I was reading that in the medical community, common ground can be this: vaccines are clearly not responsible for the protection conferred by our inbuilt immunity, nor is the HPV virus some inevitable force of lethality that only universal HPV vaccinations can effectively reverse. So they're saying it's neither one nor the other. So on that ground alone, how can you reasonably justify a widespread mandate?
Right. The mandate's the issue.
Yep.
Whether or not you should have the vaccination, that goes back to the whole discussion with the pediatrician. What does it prevent? How is it spread? What is the likelihood of my child developing the disease that we're protecting against? And what are the risks? I mean, wouldn't you want to know what all the risks of the vaccination are before you have to have it? And why is the government telling me that I have to have it for my child?
And it certainly is an expensive prospect. Now they're saying, too, that boys are included in the mandate, and saying that those who are opposed to it are saying that it's not cost-effective for boys. There's very few who get them, but apparently 12,000 women and 7,000 men develop cancers caused by HPV. Obviously, men aren't getting cervical cancer. There's some getting something else that's related. But nevertheless, 12,000, 7,000 certainly says that there are some significant numbers there. But to say that boys should have it, they're trying to make it a gender-neutral approach, and they justify it by saying in other states, there is, number one, no direct method for testing boys to see if they have the HPV, and there are a lot of girls who aren't taking the vaccination in the first place. So they're trying to cover the bases by saying that boys should take this too. Again, that brings to the question up again, how can you mandate such with that kind of reasoning? Again,
it's that whole issue of how far should the government reach into somebody's private life. And it's interesting because the argument against this is also the argument against other requirements that the government may want to impose. And there will be people who might label themselves as conservative on opposite sides of the same issue. And for me, it's pretty consistent. I don't think the government needs to get into somebody's life unless, as I said at the beginning, there's a measurable risk to public safety and health, or some other compelling reason for the government to be involved in that decision-making process. In this particular case, I haven't spoken to experts. I don't know what they would say, but I think the government, before they make that mandate, should have allowed the public debate to be heard. And if there is a mandate, David, does that mean that we should be forced to pay for it, or should that become a subsidy? I mean, there are a lot of fairly struggling people in the state of Rhode Island and others places too. This foists upon them maybe an unnecessary burden at this time. Should that be allowed to happen? Right. And so you would think that if there is a need for the government to protect public safety, that the government should be providing funds to help protect public safety. Now, whether that's through universal health care, a whole different issue. We can talk about that some other time. That would provide the coverage, or some other way of doing it. There should be ways of funding it that doesn't require the individual to pay for it. And, you know, to your point, even with the health care situation as it is, apparently you can have some exemptions based on not having money, or maybe not a home, or some other, you have some other reasons for exemptions that are financial, saying I don't want to take that vaccine. There's certainly one under that current health care And there situation. Are some states, as we talked about at the beginning, where there are personal reasons for you being able to choose the exemption. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, it's the religious exemption, so the House thing's not going to work. Good point. The issue about just simple ethics. If it's not a mandate and someone is saying, a parent is saying, I don't think I want my child to have this kind of vaccination because I believe that it is commensurate with advocating early premarital sex. Can that in and of itself ever be a justification for someone deciding to not vaccinate their child if it isn't a law? If they're just saying we really strongly suggest it, even if the doctor says, I strongly suggest it. Right. So that's the whole conversation, I think, that someone should be allowed to have with their pediatrician. And the pediatrician should be the one to explain the advantages to having it, the reasons for having it. Perhaps there are non-sexual reasons for having this vaccination that need to be explained. Perhaps there are other benefits of having it. Perhaps the risks outweigh those benefits. But your personal beliefs, the advantages and protections that are provided by the vaccination, and the risks of having the vaccination are all of the issues that should go into that private discussion that you have with your pediatrician. Again, balance that or compare that or contrast it with, we know that polio is a devastating disease, and there might be some risks to having that vaccination, but the risks to the individual are far outweighed by the benefits to society. So clearly that's one where it should be mandated. And it's your private right being trampled on, yes, but there's a compelling reason for doing that. Tell me what the compelling reason is for this other vaccination, and I'll listen to it, but I haven't heard it yet.
Right. And for the young people, unfortunately, many of them don't, although they should now have better care as adolescents or pediatric or adolescents. They should have better medical care, and it makes sense that it could be in the doctor's purview to have that discussion with them. But if they aren't going to doctors, then I guess that's cut off at the pass too. And unfortunately, not a lot of parents are well, or mothers, fathers, however it is, single-parent families. Not all of them are either willing or well educated about what reason they should have to suggest that their child have it, or that that's continue. I wonder what they can do, though, to get that into a broader conversation, so more people are apt to know about it, whether they go to a doctor or they don't, even though we know they should.
Right, and you know, as I understand it, there are certain screenings and things done at schools when children go in.
Great point.
And so that could be part of the discussion as those things are taking place.
What a good idea. If that, talk about having it become part of the public discussion, that's a very good idea. Hopefully, if Rhode Island is having this brought to the forefront almost daily. I know that there was an article, another editorial article in the Providence Journal today that was citing that they believe it's a good thing. At least this may give us another opportunity to let more people understand it.
And I'm not saying that it's not a good thing,
sure,
but I'm saying that there should be some public debate and some information presented to the public with experts weighing in and telling us why the government really needs to intervene in this situation, but I don't think that that discussion's taken place.
And in the short amount of time that we have left, they're talking about it being the 7th grader. That is the year because they want it to be supposedly before there is some sexual activity, and they want a 5-year coverage time so that they're expecting that within that window the kids are safe.
Right.
Is that another reason why you might want to have that discussion?
Yeah, and I think there was also something about a 3-dose step or something.
Yes.
Right. But yeah, I mean, again, I would like to hear from an expert who knows more about this than I do on the compelling reason for it. But if you as a parent have a religious belief that this is something that is really going to raise issues with my child that I don't want raised, I think you have a right to take that exemption and not do it.
It's a great point. And of course, since this has all started since 2006, that the CDC thinks it's a terrific idea. There's no long-term determination of what the long-term effects are as yet, so that's another good reason to challenge it. We hope that this has been helpful to you. It certainly raises some topics that have been controversial, but certainly has raised some points that you might want to consider, whether it's with your family, your legislator, your doctor. Please stay tuned to the discussion of law matters, because the discussion matters to you, the law matters to you. Thanks for tuning in.